remember the exact moment it all fell apart. My name's Clara, I'm 33, and I'd like to think I've always been honest. That's what I told myself anyway. Honesty was how I justified so many things I probably shouldn't have said. It wasn't until I saw the look on Marcus's face, his expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and a quiet, simmering kind of hurt, that I realized honesty could be its own weapon. I wish I could say I stopped myself before it went too far, but I didn't. We were sitting in the living room that night, the TV playing something neither of us was paying attention to. He was in his usual spot, one leg folded under him on the couch, flipping through his phone while I sipped on a glass of wine. It had been one of those long days where I couldn't pinpoint what exactly was wrong, only that everything felt slightly off. Marcus had asked me something. I don't even remember what anymore. Something about us, about why I'd been distant. I heard myself answering before I could stop, my voice too sharp, too tired. It's not just me, you know. Your body, God, Marcus, it's part of the reason I can't feel close to you. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt the air shift between us. It was as if the room itself had inhaled sharply, holding its breath for what would come next. He looked up from his phone, his brows furrowing as though he hadn't heard me correctly. "What?" he said, his voice quiet, confused, but I didn't back down, I couldn't. The tension in my chest pushed me forward, even as a voice in the back of my mind screamed at me to stop. "I'm just saying, intimacy has been hard lately, and it's not just about me. You've let yourself go, Marcus." I don't know how to say it any other way. The silence that followed was unbearable. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. Marcus just sat there, staring at me, his face pale and still in a way that made my stomach twist. Finally, he got up. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were afraid that anything sudden might break something fragile. He didn't look at me as he walked out of the room. The sound of the bedroom door clicking shut echoed through the apartment, louder than it should have been. I sat there for what felt like hours, the wine glass cold and heavy in my hand. I didn't follow him. Part of me wanted to, but another part, the part that had spoken those awful words in the first place, kept me rooted in place. My thoughts spiraled, a chaotic mix of defensiveness and guilt. Why did I say that? Was it really untrue? And even if it was true, did that make it okay? I started to justify myself, as I often did. Honesty is important, isn't it? People say communication is the key to a healthy relationship. Hadn't Marcus always said he wanted us to be open with each other? But beneath those rationalizations was a deeper truth I didn't want to face. I'd hurt him. I'd used his vulnerability against him, not because I wanted to fix things, but because I wanted to push him away. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, its hands moving in slow, deliberate circles. I stared at the empty couch where Marcus had been sitting, my mind replaying the moment again and again. His face haunted me, the way his eyes had darkened, his jaw tightening as if to keep himself from saying something he'd regret. I thought about following him to the bedroom, but what would I even say? Sorry. The word felt too small, too meaningless after what I'd done. I picked up my phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media, the bright screen doing little to distract me from the ache in my chest. Pictures of happy couples, engagement announcements, vacation snapshots, they all felt like a cruel reminder of what I was failing to be. I wanted to blame him, to tell myself that his body was just an excuse for the real problem. But deep down, I knew better. I'd been pulling away for months, retreating into myself in a way that even I didn't fully understand. When I finally worked up the courage to move, the apartment felt eerily quiet. I walked down the hallway, my steps hesitant, and stopped outside the bedroom door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it. I pressed my ear to the wood, straining to hear something, anything, that might tell me what he was thinking, but there was nothing. Just silence. I went back to the living room, curling up on the couch with a blanket that felt too heavy. The hours dragged on, and at some point I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, the first rays of sunlight were creeping through the blinds, casting long, golden shadows across the room. My body ached from the awkward position, and my throat was dry. The bedroom door was still closed. The apartment was quiet in a way that made my ears ring. I stared at the bedroom door, still closed, and something inside me wavered. I tried to tell myself it was just another argument. We'd had fights before, who doesn't? But this one felt different. He hadn't yelled, hadn't fought back. He'd just left the room, and in doing so, he'd taken something with him that I wasn't sure I could get back. I made myself coffee, my hands trembling as I poured the water. The mug felt too hot against my palms, but I held it anyway, needing the grounding sensation. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my emails, checking messages, anything to avoid thinking about the night before. But the words blurred together, meaningless, as my mind kept drifting back to the look on Marcus's face. Eventually, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I walked back to the bedroom and stood outside the door again, heart pounding. My fingers brushed against the doorknob, hesitating before I finally turned it. The bed was made. His side of the room was empty, the blinds drawn shut. For a moment, I thought maybe he was in the bathroom or out for a walk. But when I turned and saw the closet door open, my stomach dropped. The hangers on his side were bare, and a suitcase was missing from the shelf. Panic set in as I rushed around the apartment, searching for some sign that he was still here. His shoes were gone from the entryway. His laptop, always left on the kitchen counter, was missing. On the dining table, there was a piece of paper folded neatly in half. I stared at it for a long time, my hands shaking as I reached for it. The note was brief, written in his neat, deliberate handwriting. "I need space. Please don't call me." That was it. No explanation, no reassurance that he'd come back. Just those two sentences, stark and final. I sank into the nearest chair, the note trembling in my hands. My chest felt tight, the air thick and unyielding. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. He wouldn't just leave, not like this. Not over one fight. But it wasn't just one fight, was it? I'd been pulling away for months, finding fault in everything he did, everything he was. And now, when I'd crossed a line I didn't even know was there, he'd reached his limit. I couldn't sit still. I paced the apartment, trying to make sense of the chaos in my head. Was I angry, hurt, scared? The emotions bled into one another, indistinguishable and overwhelming. My mind raced with questions. Where had he gone? How long would he be gone? Would he even come back? I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over his name in my contacts. I wanted to call him, to demand an explanation, to beg him to come home. But his note was clear. Don't call. The words felt like a wall between us, insurmountable and cold. Instead, I opened our text thread. The last message was from him, a picture he'd sent 2 days ago of the sunset he'd seen on his drive home from work. "Thought you'd like this," he'd written. I stared at it, my throat tightening before typing out a message. "Marcus, I'm sorry. Please come back. Let's talk. I didn't mean what I said." I stared at the words, my finger hovering over the send button, but something stopped me. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I didn't mean it, and wasn't that the real problem? I deleted the message and threw my phone onto the couch, frustrated with myself, with him, with everything. The hours blurred together as I sat there, replaying every moment of our relationship in my mind. I thought about the way he used to make me laugh, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. I thought about the nights we'd stayed up talking, sharing dreams and fears in the quiet darkness. And I thought about the slow drift, the way we'd stopped reaching for each other without even realizing it. At some point, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the apartment. The silence pressed down on me, heavier than it had been that morning. I realized I hadn't eaten all day, but the thought of food made my stomach turn. I finally made my way back to the couch, curling up under the same blanket I'd used the night before. The note was still on the table, its words etched into my mind. "I need space. Please don't call me." I whispered the words to myself, as if saying them out loud might make them easier to bear. But they weren't. They felt like a verdict, one I wasn't ready to accept. The next morning came too soon. I hadn't slept much, drifting in and out of restless dreams where Marcus was always just out of reach. I woke up with a dull ache behind my eyes and the same hollow feeling in my chest that had settled there the night before. His note sat where I'd left it, mocking me with its simplicity. I picked it up again, reading the words over and over, searching for some hidden meaning, some clue that might help me understand. But there was nothing. Just his handwriting, neat and detached like a stranger's. I told myself I'd give him space. That's what he wanted, and the least I could do was respect that. But the apartment felt wrong without him. His absence was everywhere. In the empty chair at the kitchen table, the untouched toothbrush on the bathroom counter, the unspoken words lingering in the air. By noon, I was pacing again, my mind racing in circles. I thought about calling his sister, Emma, but quickly dismissed the idea. She adored Marcus, and while she was always kind to me, I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd take his side without hesitation. Then again, maybe she should. I sat on the edge of the bed we used to share, staring at the framed photo on the nightstand. It was from our honeymoon, taken by a friendly stranger on a beach in Bali. We looked happy, genuinely happy in a way that felt foreign now. My fingers brushed over the glass, tracing the outline of his smile. When had it started to fade? The question haunted me as I got up and started cleaning the apartment, desperate for something to do. I scrubbed the counters, wiped the windows, even reorganized the bookshelf. Anything to keep my hands busy and my thoughts at bay. But the memories wouldn't stop coming. I thought about the first time we met, at a mutual friend's barbecue. Marcus had been so easy to talk to, his laugh infectious. I remembered how he'd asked me out, his voice steady but his hands fidgeting with his keys. And I remembered how I'd fallen for him, slowly at first, then all at once. But I also remembered the fights. The small, cutting remarks that had started to creep into our conversations. The nights spent on opposite sides of the couch, the space between us growing wider and wider. And I remembered the way I'd stopped trying, convincing myself it was easier to retreat than to confront the things I didn't want to face. By evening, I couldn't take the quiet anymore. I grabbed my phone and opened our text thread again. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but the words wouldn't come. What was I even supposed to say? I'm sorry felt too small, too hollow. Come home felt selfish, a plea rooted more in my fear of being alone than in any real effort to fix what was broken. I closed the app and leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. The weight of my own thoughts was unbearable. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do something to release the pressure building inside me. But all I could do was sit there, frozen in my own guilt and frustration. The hours dragged on, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself scrolling through old photos of us. There was one from our first anniversary, taken at a small Italian restaurant he'd insisted on driving 3 hours to try. We were laughing, his arm draped around my shoulders, my head resting against his. I barely recognized myself in the picture, my smile so wide, my eyes so bright. I wondered if he was looking at these same photos, if he was thinking about me at all. Or had he already moved past it, deciding I wasn't worth the fight? The thought made my chest tighten, a sharp pang of regret cutting through me. Before I could stop myself, I started typing out a message. Marcus, I know you said not to call, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't know why I said what I did. Please, can we talk? I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the send button. Every instinct told me to delete it, to leave him alone like he'd asked. But the thought of doing nothing, of letting him slip further away, was unbearable. I pressed send. The message hung there, blue and unread, a tiny timestamp marking the moment I'd broken his one request. I waited, my heart pounding, for the telltale bubble that would signal he was typing. But it never came. Minutes turned into hours, and still, there was nothing. I told myself he just needed time, that he would answer eventually. But as the night stretched on, the silence became deafening, and the ache in my chest grew heavier. I curled up on the couch again, the glow of my phone screen illuminating the dark room. The unanswered message stared back at me, a reminder of the gulf I'd created between us. And for the first time, I wondered if it was a gap we could ever bridge. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of waiting. Each morning, I woke with a tight knot in my stomach, hoping I'd find a response from Marcus, but there was nothing. His silence stretched on like an invisible barrier, keeping me trapped in my own thoughts. I stayed busy during the day, throwing myself into work and errands, but every quiet moment brought me back to the same question. Had I ruined everything? The thought felt unbearable, like a splinter lodged deep in my chest. I replayed the moment over and over, dissecting every word, every pause, every fleeting look on his face. By the third day, I started to wonder if he'd blocked me. I tried calling once, just once, but the line rang through to voicemail, and I quickly hung up before I could leave a message. Shame washed over me as I stared at my phone, the weight of his absence settling heavily on my chest. The apartment felt emptier than ever. I found myself wandering from room to room, searching for remnants of him. His cologne still lingered faintly in the bathroom, and I caught myself standing there for minutes at a time, inhaling the fading scent. In the closet, one of his jackets was still hanging where he'd forgotten it. I ran my fingers over the fabric, the memories of him wearing it flooding back in vivid detail. I tried reaching out to Emma. It felt like a last resort, and I agonized over the decision for hours before dialing her number. When she picked up, her voice was warm but cautious, like she already knew something was wrong. "Clara," she said. "Hi, everything okay?" I stumbled through a greeting, my voice faltering as I tried to explain. I just wanted to see if you'd heard from Marcus." There was a pause, just long enough to make my stomach twist. "I have," she said finally. "He's staying with me for a bit." Relief and dread washed over me in equal measure. At least I knew where he was, but the fact that he hadn't told me himself stung more than I wanted to admit. "How is he?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emma hesitated. "He's okay, quiet. He told me he needed space, and I'm trying to respect that." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Did he say anything about—" My voice cracked, and I had to swallow hard before continuing. "About us." Her sigh was soft but heavy, like she was carrying a weight she didn't know how to share. "He told me you had a fight, that things were said." She paused again, her tone careful. "Clara, I don't know the details, but Marcus is really hurt. I think he needs time to figure out how he feels." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I didn't mean to hurt him," I said, the tears spilling over before I could stop them. "I didn't mean any of it." "I believe you," Emma said gently. "But he's the one you need to tell, not me." I thanked her and hung up, but her words stayed with me. "He's really hurt." The guilt felt like a physical weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I wanted to call him again, to show up at Emma's door if I had to, but I knew it wouldn't help. The more I pushed, the further he would retreat. That night, I opened my journal for the first time in months. Writing used to be my way of sorting through emotions, but I'd stopped when things between Marcus and me began to unravel. Now, the blank page stared back at me, its emptiness mirroring the ache inside me. I started writing, letting the words pour out without thinking. I wrote about the fight, about the things I'd said, and the way his face had crumpled when he heard them. I wrote about the silence that had followed, the heavy, suffocating quiet that still hadn't lifted. And then I wrote about the truth. The parts of myself I didn't want to face. My insecurities, my fear of vulnerability, my tendency to lash out when I felt cornered. I wrote about how I'd been pulling away from Marcus, not because of him, but because I didn't know how to face my own reflection. When I finally put the pen down, my hands were shaking. The words on the page were raw and ugly, but they were mine. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of clarity, though it was accompanied by a deeper, sharper sense of regret. I sat there for a long time, staring at the journal and wondering if it was too late to fix what I'd broken. Marcus wanted space, but how much space was enough? How much time was too much? As the night wore on, I made a decision. I couldn't force him to come back, but I could at least try to show him that I was willing to do the work, that I was ready to face the parts of myself I'd been hiding from, even if it was painful. I reached for my phone, opening a new message. "Marcus, I know I've hurt you, and I know I can't take back what I said, but I'm trying to understand why I said it and how I can make things right. Please know I'm not giving up on us, even if you need time. I love you." This time, I didn't hesitate. I pressed send and set the phone down, my heart pounding as I waited for a response that might never come. The message sat unread. I kept glancing at my phone, willing it to light up, but it remained stubbornly still. It was worse at night, the silence stretching into something oppressive. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the heater the only sound. My mind replayed everything I'd said to Marcus in endless loops, as if dissecting it could change the outcome. The truth was, I'd hurt him, and no apology could erase the damage. It was something I had to live with, a weight that settled deeper into my chest each day. But the longer the silence stretched, the more desperate I felt. I wanted to call Emma again to ask if he'd read my message or even seen it. But I knew it would only make me seem more frantic, more selfish. On the 5th day, I found myself back in the kitchen, scrubbing the counters with unnecessary force. I hadn't heard from Marcus, and the ache of his absence was turning into something sharper, something that felt suspiciously like anger. How could he just walk away? How could he leave me alone to sift through the ruins of what we'd built? I hated myself for feeling it, for making this about me, even in my own head. But the questions wouldn't stop. What did he expect me to do? How was I supposed to fix this if he wouldn't even talk to me by evening? The anger had faded, replaced by an emptiness I couldn't shake. I sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, too drained to do anything else. My phone buzzed and my heart jumped. But it wasn't Marcus. It was a friend I hadn't spoken to in months, asking if I wanted to catch up. I ignored the message, my focus still stuck on the one person I wanted to hear from. I picked up the journal again, flipping back to the pages I'd written earlier in the week. The words stared back at me, raw and unpolished. But there was something cathartic about seeing them, about acknowledging the truth I'd spent so long avoiding. I wrote again, this time focusing on the good memories. The first time Marcus said he loved me, the way his face lit up when he cooked dinner and it actually turned out well, the way he held my hand during movies even when it made his arm go numb. But as I wrote, I realized something that made my chest tighten. I couldn't remember the last time we'd had a moment like that. Not because he'd stopped trying, but because I had. I'd spent so much time building walls, guarding myself against the fear of disappointment, that I hadn't noticed how much I was shutting him out. I put the pen down, my hands trembling. The weight of my realization was suffocating. It wasn't just about what I'd said that night. It was about everything that had led us there. All the little moments where I'd chosen distance over connection, blame over vulnerability. I thought about calling my therapist, someone I hadn't seen in over a year. The idea felt daunting, but the alternative, continuing to spiral in my own head, was worse. The next morning, I made the call. The receptionist squeezed me into a cancellation slot, and by the afternoon, I was sitting in the familiar office, staring at the neutral-colored walls. My therapist, Dr. Vega, greeted me with her usual calm demeanor, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. "It's been a while," she said, her voice gentle. "What's been going on?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. But then they spilled out, a tangled mess of guilt, fear, and longing. I told her about Marcus, about the fight, about the ways I'd been pulling away without even realizing it. "I don't know how to fix it," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I feel like I've already lost him." Dr. Vega nodded, letting the silence stretch for a moment before responding. "It sounds like you've been carrying a lot for a long time," she said, "and it's finally catching up to you." I swallowed hard, her words hitting too close to home. "But what if it's too late?" She tilted her head, considering. "It might be too late to undo the past, Clara." "But it's not too late to understand it, and to decide how you want to move forward, whether or not Marcus is ready to do the same." Her words stayed with me long after I left the session. I couldn't control Marcus's choices or his timeline, but I could start to take responsibility for my own. That night, I sat down at the kitchen table with my journal and wrote him a letter. Not a text, not a call. A real letter, the kind I could hold in my hands. I poured everything into it, my apology, my reflections, my love for him. I didn't know if he'd read it or if it would even matter. But it felt like the first real step I'd taken in weeks. When I finished, I sealed the envelope and set it aside, my heart pounding. The rest was out of my hands. The letter sat on the table for 2 days. Every time I looked at it, my stomach twisted in knots. I debated over and over whether to send it. What if it was too much? What if it wasn't enough? What if it didn't even reach him? By the 3rd day, I couldn't bear the indecision anymore. I tucked the envelope into my bag and walked to the post office. The clerk barely glanced at me as I handed it over, her indifferent efficiency in sharp contrast to the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Watching her stamp the envelope and drop it into the bin felt surreal. That was it, my last chance to reach him, sealed and sent. Walking home, I felt lighter, but the relief was fleeting. The anxiety crept back and almost immediately, whispering all the ways this could go wrong. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they clung to me like static. The days stretched on with no response. I kept busy, throwing myself into work and therapy. Dr. Vega encouraged me to focus on myself, to explore what I wanted and needed beyond Marcus. It felt strange, almost wrong, to think about a future that didn't revolve around him. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized how much of myself I'd lost in the relationship, not because of him, but because of the walls I'd built to protect myself. One evening, a week after I sent the letter, I was sitting on the couch, flipping aimlessly through a magazine, when my phone buzzed. My heart jumped, but I forced myself to take a deep breath before looking. It was a text from Marcus. "I got your letter. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. He wanted to talk. I didn't know what that meant, if it was good, bad, or somewhere in between, but it was more than I dared to hope for. My fingers trembled as I typed out a reply. "Yes. Just let me know when and where." His response came quickly. "Tomorrow, 6 p.m., Emma's place." The next 24 hours were excruciating. I went through every possible scenario in my mind, imagining what he might say, how I would respond. I replayed our last conversation over and over, trying to prepare myself for anything. When the time finally came, I arrived at Emma's apartment a few minutes early. My palms were sweaty, and my heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I knocked on the door, and a moment later it opened to reveal Marcus. He looked different. Tired, yes, but there was a calmness in his expression that I hadn't seen in weeks. He stepped aside to let me in, and I followed him to the living room. Emma wasn't there. He must have asked her to give us privacy. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Marcus gestured for me to sit, and I perched on the edge of the couch, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, but not as suffocating as I'd feared. Finally, Marcus spoke. "I read your letter," he said, his voice steady but low. "Thank you for sending it." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I needed time to process everything. What you said, what I felt, what it all meant." He paused, glancing down at his hands. "It hurt, Clara, a lot, but I don't think you said it because you wanted to hurt me. I think you said it because you've been hurting too." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I blinked them back. "I have," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But that doesn't excuse what I said. I was cruel, Marcus, and I'm so sorry." He nodded slowly. "I know you're sorry, and I know this isn't just about what happened that night. There's been a distance between us for a while, and we both let it grow." Hearing him say it out loud was both a relief and a knife to the heart. I opened my mouth to respond, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish," he said gently. "I don't think either of us realized how much we were drifting until it was too late. But the thing is, Clara, I don't want to lose you, I need to know that we're both willing to do the work to make this better." The weight of his words settled over me, and for the first time in weeks I felt a glimmer of hope. "I want to," I said, my voice firm despite the tears streaming down my face. "I've been trying. I started therapy again. I've been looking at myself, really looking, and I know I have a lot to work on. But I want to do it, Marcus, for me, for us." He sat back, his shoulders relaxing slightly. That's all I needed to hear. We talked for hours that night, unraveling the threads of our pain and weaving them into something new. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were both reaching for each other instead of pulling away. When I left Emma's apartment, the ache in my chest was still there, but it felt different, lighter, more hopeful. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Marcus and I began the slow, careful process of rebuilding. It wasn't seamless, and it wasn't always pretty, but for the first time in what felt like forever, we were trying. Really trying. We agreed to take things one day at a time, which felt both freeing and terrifying. There were no grand promises or sweeping gestures, just small, deliberate steps. We started by carving out time for honest conversations. No distractions, no defensiveness. It wasn't easy. Sometimes, the things we uncovered were painful to hear, but the fact that we were talking at all felt like progress. Marcus moved back into the apartment about a month after our talk at Emma's. When he walked through the door with his bags, the sight of him standing there felt surreal. I had to fight the urge to throw my arms around him, knowing we still had a long way to go. "I guess I'm home," he said softly, his eyes scanning the space like he was seeing it for the first time. "Welcome back," I said, my voice tinged with both relief and nervousness. We spent the evening unpacking his things together, a quiet but significant act that felt symbolic of our efforts to untangle the knots in our relationship. Therapy became a staple for both of us. Marcus started seeing a therapist on his own, which was something he'd never been open to before. And though we hadn't yet committed to couples sessions, we both knew it was something we'd eventually need. One night after we'd eaten dinner, we sat on the couch in silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt heavy or strained. It was comfortable, almost peaceful. I glanced over at him, noticing the way his shoulders looked less tense, his face less guarded. "Marcus," I said, breaking the quiet. He turned to me, his expression soft. "Yeah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest, even if it's hard." His brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Okay, do you think we'll make it?" The words felt fragile, like they might shatter the moment they left my mouth. Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. Finally, he exhaled deeply. "I don't know," he said, his voice steady but honest. "But I think we have a chance, and I think it's worth trying." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I managed a small smile. That's all I needed to hear. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I found myself rediscovering pieces of who I was. The more I explored my insecurities and fears in therapy, the clearer it became how much they had shaped my actions. I started to notice patterns I hadn't seen before, the way I deflected when I felt vulnerable, the way I used criticism as a shield. Marcus noticed the changes, too. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, he stopped and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What is it?" I asked, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "You're different," he said simply, "in a good way." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth spread through me. "I'm trying," I said, my voice soft. "I can see that," he replied. "And I want you to know I see it. It means a lot." It wasn't a perfect moment. There was still a pile of dishes in the sink and a million unresolved questions about our future, but it felt like a step forward. The truth was, I didn't know what the future held for us. I didn't know if we'd ever fully heal from the wounds we'd inflicted on each other. But I did know this. We were both willing to try, to stumble and learn and grow together. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Late one night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about the moment it all fell apart. The words I'd said, the way Marcus had looked at me before he walked out the door. The memory still stung, but it didn't feel as sharp as it once had. I reached for Marcus's hand under the covers, threading my fingers through his. He stirred slightly, turning toward me in the dark. "Everything okay?" he murmured sleepily. "Yeah," I whispered. "Everything's okay." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it. The calm was fragile, but it was real. Each day felt like a delicate balancing act, one where every conversation, every shared glance carried the weight of our unspoken fears and our cautious hope. Marcus and I had both agreed to start fresh, but the past had a way of lingering like a shadow, waiting for a moment to reappear. It came one evening when we were sorting through a box of old photos. We'd been laughing at the awkward poses and questionable fashion choices when Marcus pulled out a picture of us from 3 years ago. It was from a beach trip, his arm around my shoulders, my head resting against his chest. We looked carefree, like the version of ourselves we'd been trying to find again. He held the photo for a long moment before setting it down. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" he asked, his tone measured but heavy. I felt my chest tighten. "All the time," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. Marcus leaned back against the couch, his eyes distant. "I've been trying to figure out if there was a specific moment, like when did it start? When did we stop being that?" I didn't have an answer, or rather, I had too many. I thought about the little fights that had gone unresolved, the times we'd chosen silence over confrontation, the nights we'd both lain in bed staring at opposite walls. "I think it was gradual," I said finally. "Like a slow leak. You don't notice it at first, but eventually you realize everything's been draining away." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, that sounds about right." For a moment, the weight of our shared regret pressed down on us, but then Marcus reached for my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "We can't change what happened," he said, his voice steady. "But I don't want to lose us, Clara. Not again." Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. "Neither do I." The conversation hung between us, raw and unresolved, but it was a reminder of why we were trying. We weren't chasing an idealized version of ourselves. We were fighting for the chance to grow into something stronger, something more honest. Over time, the edges of our relationship began to soften. We found a rhythm that felt more real, less performative. Marcus started joining me for therapy sessions, which was a revelation in itself. Sitting in that room together, talking openly about our fears and frustrations, was like tearing down walls I hadn't realized we'd built. One session, Marcus admitted something that stayed with me for weeks. "There were times I felt like I was walking on eggshells," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Like no matter what I did, it wouldn't be good enough. And I know some of that's on me, but it was hard." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd always prided myself on being strong, on not needing constant reassurance. But in my efforts to shield myself from disappointment, I'd created an environment where Marcus felt like he couldn't win. "I'm sorry," I said, tears spilling over despite my efforts to hold them back. "I never wanted you to feel that way. I didn't know how to let my guard down." "It's not about blame," he said gently. "It's about understanding. I think we're both starting to get there." Months passed and life began to feel more stable. We laughed more, talked more, and fought less. But even in our progress, there were moments of doubt. Healing wasn't linear, and some days the scars felt too fresh to ignore. One night, as we lay in bed, Marcus turned to me, his voice soft in the darkness. "Do you think we'll ever stop worrying about messing this up?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "Maybe not, but I think that's okay. It means we care enough to try." He pulled me closer, his arms wrapping around me in a way that felt both protective and vulnerable. "I can live with that," he murmured. In the quiet of the night, I felt a strange sense of peace. We weren't perfect, we weren't even close, but we were here together, trying, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like more than enough. A year later, I found myself standing in the same kitchen where everything had unraveled, preparing dinner while Marcus sat at the table, scrolling through his phone. The air was filled with the rich aroma of garlic and herbs, and the soft hum of music played in the background. It was an ordinary evening, one of countless we'd shared since deciding to rebuild, but it felt extraordinary in its simplicity. Marcus looked up, catching my eye. "Need help with anything?" I smiled, shaking my head. "I've got it, just sit there and relax for once." He grinned but didn't argue, leaning back in his chair as he watched me. There was an ease between us now, one that had been hard-won through months of patience, honesty, and vulnerability. When we sat down to eat, the conversation flowed effortlessly. We talked about our days, joked about something silly, and made loose plans for the weekend. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough. Later, as we cleaned up, Marcus paused and turned to me. "Hey," he said, his tone soft but serious. "Yeah," I asked, glancing up from the sink. "I've been thinking about how far we've come, and I just wanted to say thank you for not giving up on us." The words struck me harder than I expected. I put down the dish I was washing, taking a moment to breathe. "I didn't want to," I said quietly, "but there were times I didn't know if it was enough." His gaze softened. It is." I wiped my hands on the towel, moving closer to him. There was a deep comfort in how we stood together now, a space where the cracks from before didn't feel like gaping wounds anymore. They were part of us, yes, but no longer the defining parts. "I think I was always scared of what would happen if we tried to fix things," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But now I don't feel scared anymore." Marcus reached for my hand, pulling me gently toward him. "Good, because I think we're stronger now, not because of what we've been through, but because of how we're still here, choosing each other every day." I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I didn't cry. Not this time. This was a new kind of release, one that came from understanding that, while the past would always shape us, it didn't control us anymore. He leaned in and kissed me softly, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the quiet certainty that we could face whatever came next together.